Hello and welcome to this Come to Jesus Daily Devotional. I trust you are well today. As we continue in our God's Vision for the Church series, we're going to be looking at how the church is God's holy temple and how, as such, we're to seek to repent of all sin and pursue holiness. So let's read from 1 Corinthians 3:16 to 17. Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in your midst? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person. For God's temple is sacred, and you together are that temple. It's easy to forget important things, and here Paul is urging the church at Corinth to remember. He asks them, don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple? They've forgotten their identity as God's holy temple, his holy people. Some at Corinth have forgotten this, and they are getting involved in all sorts of terrible sins, sexual immorality, division. And we can damage and destroy God's temple in a number of ways. For example, poor understanding and ignorance can destroy God's temple. If we don't understand what the church is, God's vision for the church, we won't build according to his design. We read in the Old Testament how God gave them the blueprints, as it were. He gave them the direction for building the tabernacle and then the temple. He even said to David, you're not going to build it, Solomon's going to build it. And if we don't receive direction from God, if we have poor understanding, we'll destroy God's temple because we won't build it according to his template. Secondly, the wrong foundation. We all know Jesus told a parable about the man who built his house on the sand and the other person who built his house on the rock. And when the storm came, the house that was built on sand collapsed. The house that was built on the rock stood. And he said that the house built on the rock was built on his teaching. And we need to build on the right foundation if it's going to be a church at all, and if it's going to stand. And we read in 1 Corinthians 3:10 to 11, by the grace God has given me, I laid a foundation as a wise builder, and someone else is building on it. But each one should build with care, for no one can lay any foundation other than the one already laid, which is Jesus Christ. You see, the church is built upon Jesus Christ, and specifically it's built upon the gospel. We're saved through the gospel. Our identity comes through the gospel. Our justification comes through the gospel. Our being born again comes through the gospel. Our eternal hope comes through the gospel. Our righteousness is from Christ. The fact that we can pray comes from the gospel. You see, with the right foundation comes the right outcomes. The danger comes when we start putting the outcomes as the foundation. So we make social action and even prayer or worship or evangelism and many good things. They're the outcome of the gospel. But Jesus Christ himself is the cornerstone and the foundation. So we can destroy the temple by building on the wrong foundation. Sin, sexual sin particularly, a big issue at Corinth. Sexual sin is a big issue in our day, isn't it? And we can allow these things to we can try to change our foundation and say, yeah, it's fine. We can allow sin. We can allow these modern views on relationships and marriage and so on to come in. No, sin damages God's holy temple. And that's why he says to them, don't you know? Fourthly, unforgiveness damages the temple, because we're meant to be those living stones built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by the Spirit. And if we're broken apart, we're no longer being built together, we're damaging God's temple. Unfaithfulness. So many of us are just hit and miss, aren't we? We don't come to church. We're not involved in the community. We have so many other things as our priorities when God calls his church his holy temple. So if it's his holy temple, and if we're his holy temple, we're set apart for him, then surely our involvement and faithfulness to church should be way up on our priority. And too often it's not, is it? And so in response, Let me read again from our text, 1 Corinthians 3:16-17. Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in your midst? And if anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person. For God's temple is sacred and you together are that temple. The temple is sacred to God. We saw earlier how in another devotional that Peter says that we've been purchased by the precious blood of Christ. How sacred are we? We're his precious temple. He wants us to build according to his plan rather than tearing it down. You've got to have the right foundation, avoiding sin, living for Jesus, making it a priority. I love that account that we read about Jesus in the Gospels, about him going into the temple courts and seeing those who were selling cattle, sheep and doves, and he is outraged because they're turning his father's house into a market, and he to overturn the tables, scattered the coins of the money changers, overturned their tables, and he said, "Get these out of here, stop turning my father's house into a market." We read in John 2 verse 17 that when this happened, his disciples remembered that zeal for your house will consume me. As Jesus overturned the tables of those who were using the holy temple as a market, and so he wants us to join him in driving out all sin from our lives. May it be said of us, as it was said of him, "Zeal for your house consumes me." God bless you.